Welcome back to the Tonic podcast, everyone. My name is Drew. I'm joined by my co-host and friend, as always, Alex. Today we're going to be covering the Fairness Doctrine, a piece of legislation that is a regulation from the FCC that required broadcast news to present issues of public interest in a fair and balanced manner and give people of opposing opinions equal time. The idea was to create an arena where there was a fair representation in media. However, there's a lot of controversy and criticism of the Fairness Doctrine, and then it was eventually not enforced after the 1980s and officially removed from the FCC in 2011. So we're going to be talking about the Fairness Doctrine today and why it's being brought up again in regards to talking about media and politics. Alex, just to start off, give me your understanding of the Fairness Doctrine.
Yeah, definitely. So it's definitely a topic that I feel like we've heard a lot recently, kind of in this era of misinformation. You have some Republicans wanting to, repeal 230 of the Decency Act from the 90s. And these things are all kind of related, but not really. And I think that's why it's good that we're putting some time into this episode today. And yeah, like you said, 1949, the FCC kind of got this going, and it required that TV and radio stations devote some of their programming to controversial issues of public importance. And I want to get into public importance later, that exact terminology. But for now, it also is about opposing views, right? So if you had someone who's super anti-gay marriage and you maybe have a program about it, whatever, you'd probably want to give the equal time to someone else who has a differing view. And I do want to note that when this came out, it was about 70 years ago. So there is a huge difference in just radio and television, which the FCC was looking at this Fairness Doctrine for. And these days where we have podcasts, we have social media, we have My Pillow Guy getting banned on Twitter. Like, it's a different world.
Yeah.
So that's just what I would start out with. Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely a different world. So we do have to look at what was the purpose of it at the time and kind of the philosophy behind it. And does this apply today, or perhaps something? Sorry, I guess I have an update ready. There's something today maybe have to morph into a new version of the Fairness Doctrine. But let's break it down. And someone who broke it down really well, I think, was this guy, Dr. Stephen Hicks. He has his doctorate in philosophy, and he also studies entrepreneurship. He's an interesting figure that I found online, and he broke down this lecture about the Fairness Doctrine. He has an argument for and an argument against, and really he talks about who are the actors, right? And so he talks about how you have the broadcasters and the audience, and the argument for the Fairness Doctrine is he understood that the broadcasters, have economic incentives and in some cases might monopolize the airwaves, and the fear is that the audience is passive and easily manipulated, and kind of won't have too much of a choice. The argument for the Fairness Doctrine then says that, like, in a free market system with just broadcast and airwaves being loose, you have a win-lose scenario where the broadcasters are like, it's a predation. They're preying on the audience, and also, if you have a monopolization of like the airwaves with as far as businesses, then if a business prefers one political opinion over another, they can just decide that they'll air this opinion and won't air the other, or they'll sell airtime to this politician and they'll just decide not to sell time to the one that they don't like. And so the competitors have strengths and weaknesses that the FCC considered unfair, right? That was kind of the argument for. Do you think that like do you see that do you see that as the reality as it plays out, like that kind of structure?
Yes and no. Like I think I told you this yesterday or something. Like I'm really torn on the Fairness Doctrine. But the one thing I would say is that I feel like the debate over the Fairness Doctrine, I feel like the root of the issue is what you see the role of the federal government should be. Right. Like, should you leave the media up to the open market, the free market, or should you leave it up to the responsibility of government regulation? And so honestly, I could see an argument either for or against using that, just depending kind of on how you see the federal government. And I lean more, especially in stuff with information, free speech and stuff like that, I kind of lean more into a laissez-faire approach when it comes to government. Though at the time I could understand the rationale, but my issue is that fairness and public opinion and public interest are always in the eye of the beholder of power at the time.
Sure.
And so that was always my issue, is because I don't think it's the best way to combat, one-sided bias, especially because, for example, you had the Kennedy administration basically use this to silence some forms of media that were on the right, that were very highly critical of the Bay of Pigs and other somewhat foreign policy disasters during the Kennedy administration. And Nixon was very against this. He spoke out about how the Fairness Doctrine actually was like limiting conservative speech or like conservative ideas. And now I'm not going to go into if that's totally true or not right now. But then when Nixon came into power, about 8 years or, whatever, about 5, 6, 7 years ago, he then used it against Democrats for a lot of the same ways. It was limiting opposing views that were highly critical, especially during Watergate. So the crux of it to me is that fairness is in the eyes of the beholder, and so there's really no way to just have I feel like an umbrella way of dealing with fairness.
In what ways did Nixon prevent or JFK how did they limit the other side's arguments using the fairness?
It was basically in the terms of, say you have like a local conservative talk radio, but it's owned by like a larger company or a larger corporation or something under that scope. Basically, especially under the Kennedy years, like early 60s, basically what they would do is there just wasn't proper funding or spotlight given to some of these more conservative ones, and let's say like the other side, or the Democrat side, was more bolstered during that time, and the same would be true. What happened during the Nixon one is that basically they kind of used it. I don't want to say to silence, but they used it in a way to kind of. I'm trying to think of best how to put this. Like it was basically used in order to decide what was fair and what was not for public interest. And so if there were controversial ideas coming out, sometimes false information, sometimes not false information, it was deemed out of the public interest. And that was both sides. It was a right or left, depending who was in power. And that just kind of goes to the crux of what my fear is about it, is that it's all arbitrary, and I don't know if the government should be deciding what is fair or what is in the public interest. And so just both of those administrations basically used this to deem what was acceptable in terms of media and like radio coverage. And so a lot of people would say that, when Reagan's administration repealed it in the 80s and conservative radio kind of took off after that, it was somewhat of a backlash to this somewhat suppressing in the 60s and 70s.
I hear that. I mean, and certainly that does just fear mine as well. What the government deems fair one day, a different government, which is different people, right? Because the government is people that make it up, not some like shadowy entity. It's literally just the people that work for it, and those people will change. And so the idea of fairness will change over time. So that's certainly an issue. I also think that the big thing is, at the time when the Fairness Doctrine was established in 1949, people got their news from the radio. And there was only so many radio waves. There was literally a scientific limitation to radio waves. You can only have so much bandwidth in space, right? If you didn't get on the FM dial or the AM dial, you're out. So I could see how at the time they figured, since there's so limited an amount of of sources of information, we need to make sure that there is some kind of mechanism in place to allow the incentive to have both sides represented. Because if there's only ABC and NBC and that's it, then you're going to have to make sure that people get represented. Now, what's interesting is I think the conversation around today, of the rehashing of the Fairness Doctrine, is actually completely different circumstances, because it's not that we have too little sources of information. It's that there's too many sources of information. That the water is so muddy now that people think that they can just, their timeline on Facebook is now their information, not a broadcasting company. So it's an interesting, when people talk about bring back the Fairness Doctrine, I think that we need to explore something of the idea of it and it, and we'll go into how private companies are doing that already on their own in a second. But I definitely don't think we should bring back the actual FCC regulation, the Fairness Doctrine, because it's just outdated. It's about broadcast and radio. I mean, another thing that I wanted to mention was, and I used to believe this too, which was a lot of people on the left would say things like, oh, without the Fairness Doctrine, that started Fox News. We get Fox News because of Reagan ending the Fairness Doctrine. And in reality, that's not true, because, again, the Fairness Doctrine is only about broadcast, whereas Fox News is cable, which is a private paid service where you have a private company puts cable lines underground, whereas the airwaves are just like public airwaves. And so the fairness doctrine would not have stopped Roger Ailes and his Fox News right wing, in my opinion, propaganda and other opinion, conservative viewpoint channel. That would have still happened no matter what. I think it's things like maybe Rush Limbaugh that would have had to operate differently under the fairness doctrine.
Yeah, definitely. I also think that kind of in the 70s and early 80s, there was kind of this marinating conservative kind of grassroots voice. So I would agree with you. I think there's probably a lot of factors why things like Fox News kind of took off after the 80s. You kind of had like the 24-hour news cycle come out of there with CNN.
Right. CNN.
I totally agree with you. Yeah, I think there was a lot of reasons. And it's interesting because I think you're right, is now it's completely flipped. I don't actually think the fairness doctrine should even be in the conversation because it's such an outdated act, right? I mean, it truly just doesn't encompass what we're dealing with now. And it's actually kind of interesting because there was the court case, let me see, I have it written down here, Red Lion Broadcasting versus the FCC, which was in 1969. And basically this was a challenge to the fairness doctrine. This company, Red Lion Broadcasting, was challenging the FCC's ruling on this. And basically what the Supreme Court said was that they upheld the decision, but they warned about how if the doctrine ever began to restrain speech, then it would be unconstitutional.
Right.
And then 5 years later, without ruling the doctrine unconstitutional, the court concluded in another doctrine that it does dampen the vigor and limits the variety of public debate. So that was the fear of courts, in the 60s and 70s. But I think you're absolutely right. Like, that's not the problem anymore.
Right.
I could type in Donald Trump right now on the internet, and I could get a myriad of sources with very different information. And so it's technically fair if you think about it in terms of how this actual doctrine came out. Obviously, broadcasting is different from social media and the internet, but I could get very different points of view from going on the internet. So I don't think that's the problem anymore. You know what I mean?
See, and that's where I think we have to dig in deeper because in the video from Dr. Stephen Hicks about the argument against the fairness doctrine, he lays it out. I'll go over to it real quick just to see if I can get to his whiteboard. Yeah, so
I love the whiteboard.
Yeah, and so here he talks about, look, like in this instance, the against the fairness doctrine, it's under the assumption that broadcasters, one, have the right to property, right to liberty, and profit motivation. That's all rights protected by the government. And then in this model, he also says the audience. See, this is the problem. Is the audience he says is self-responsible and active. If they think they right. And maybe that was the case back then. And maybe that was the case in the 80s where, hey, if you don't like it, turn the dial, which I think the Heritage Foundation says here in their criticism as well. It says right here, there's a simple solution for any family seeking an alternative viewpoint or any lawmaker irritated by a pugnacious talk show host. Turn the dial. And that is true, but we are in a different era now where I don't think that, my problem is with the algorithms on Facebook and the algorithms on Google and Instagram, the way that these algorithms work to kind of feed into your worldview, you're not turning the dial. Facebook is edging the dial for you. So this idea of because think about it like this, if you're on cable, if you just buy a TV and you get a basic cable package, yeah, you like everyone else has the same amount of cable shows. You can just turn the dial. But imagine if you were watching cable and you watched, sports and CNN and some other stuff. And then the cable provider decided to get rid of some of the channels they thought you weren't going to watch and then put in channels you were going to watch. So that's them turning the dial a little bit for you. Yeah, you may still turn the dial yourself from those channels, but your selection is manipulated by an algorithm designed to reinforce your worldview. I mean, that's literally how Facebook operates. So I think a good point is, I definitely don't, again, like I said, I don't want to adopt the old fairness doctrine, but there's a lesson to be learned here that the game is changing. And this idea that you can just turn the dial and somehow be on par with anyone else's feed is not true.
Absolutely. And I think you're so correct there that's why I think that honestly the fairness doctrine is somewhat of a moot point when it comes to what is next, because you're right. It's not the fact that people don't have access to information. It's the people that pass the information to us, or the algorithms that pass the information to us, might have different intentions. They don't care about giving us facts. They care about appealing to our emotions. And study again shows us that anger and hate, they do much better than information and unity. So I do agree with you, and like that kind of brings me to a question for you: isn't it interesting that we're kind of seeing this push for getting rid of like what Article 230 of the Decency Act from the 1990s, but it's from Republicans. Like that's why I find it interesting because like the Heritage Foundation in the 90s wrote this paper about
Right.
like super against the fairness doctrine, saying it's not fair, blah blah blah. But now you had in 2019 Senator Hawley, he was basically fighting to put almost like super strict government on these social media companies. And it's interesting to me, like do you think that there is some reason to what they're trying to do, or do you think it's just for political reasons of allowing people like Trump to still have a voice?
Well, I think Josh Hawley's a political hack. I mean, I think he's a hack. So I don't really, I don't think. I mean, he's already backed off of his vote against the election because he's gotten him in trouble. So I think he just was testing the waters how far he could go. And I think that big tech is a new enemy, right? I mean, obviously, I do think that like we need to be careful and regulate tech companies. We've talked about it before, so I'm not exactly like anti big tech. But I do think that like there's like Facebook is being used as a scapegoat for problems that are much larger than just Facebook, but Facebook's a part of it. I also think in the model against the fairness doctrine, part of it is that the idea that these broadcasters, or in the modern version, social media sites, have a right to their property. And so that's one of the things I want to talk about is like, if we're going to this free market thing and want to apply that to the free market of ideas, then someone who is against the fairness doctrine should also be totally fine with Twitter banning Trump. That's a broadcaster or platform holder now, exercising their right to their own property. This is our IP. So like it's this weird double flip where it's like someone who I think ideologically, if you're against the fairness doctrine, you abide by, I guess, the model that Stephen Hicks lays out. Then the banning of Trump on Twitter is a part of it.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, definitely. I think that's interesting because, especially in my old party, I guess the Republican Party, there's a huge split between them. Like right down the middle, like you kind of have still the more libertarian-minded ones who are like, let Twitter do what they want to do, let Facebook do what they want to do. But there is this kind of more. I mean, basically, the way I see it is that Reagan in the 80s kind of set the precedent for where conservative values were going in terms of free speech and media, right? Like he was kind of the North Star for, laissez-faire approaches to dealing with information. And I think we're seeing a break. Could Trump be, the next North Star for the Republican Party in some ways where they don't really care as much about actually allowing free speech, but it's more like kind of enforcing the government to be fair, which ironically kind of goes back to the fairness doctrine because, I mean, I think it's tough because you're right. Like Twitter is a private company and they have the right to do this. You know what I mean? But I would argue that a better way to do this would still be to let Trump talk, but almost keep doing what they're starting to do is fact check. Like I just feel like it's better to let that out there and maybe have an asterisk next to what he says than just silencing it. And that's why last week, I kind of mentioned about it, like a constitutional convention for the digital age. Like, I think we almost need to create something like a fairness doctrine for the digital age. And I think that would mean that Congress needs to come together and decide, like, is it feasible for someone to be banned on Twitter when literally it is like the megaphone for public opinion and public speech?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, it almost seems like Republicans want a new fairness doctrine for social media. And I think that something like that should be around. But I do think that, like, let's also, we've been up here in the philosophical ideology. Let's bring it back down to earth. This idea that this audience is self-responsible is not true. We saw a massive amount of people be manipulated into believing our election was stolen on a scale unseen before. The fact that the majority of Republicans still don't believe Joe Biden is legitimately the president is disgusting, right? That's like an extremely, extremely crazy. If you look back at 84% of Hillary Clinton voters accepted that Trump was president after he won in 2016, right? That is not what we're seeing on the other side of the aisle right now. So there's something seriously wrong. and people have been obviously manipulated, because the fact of the matter is Joe Biden won the election. So I think we put too much faith in the audience being self-responsible and active and enough to turn the dial on things that are too fringe. Like, we obviously see that that's not the case. And so we have to do something. So if it means, conservative voices should be on Twitter, but with like fact checking, sure. But I do think at the end of the day, some things that are like calling up for like fire in a theater should just not be allowed on any platform. And I think like what we saw from Donald Trump was if not there already, pretty close to yelling fire in a theater.
Yeah, definitely. And no, I mean, kind of going off of that, the Brookings Institute, I think it was back in 2019, had a great article. It's like just how to combat fake news. And they basically argue that people are going to social media and going to the internet more and more for news because they just don't trust the actual media apparatus of kind of, like CNN, Fox, whatever. Like there's just a declining trust. Like, and this is in 2019, so it's a little old, but they say 14% of Republicans believe the media report the news accurately, and 62% of Democrats do. Even though Democrats are much higher than Republicans, it shows that people don't trust the news, right? Yeah. It's kind of disturbing, especially for a democracy. And so I actually kind of have a theory, because I was thinking about this, is I think somewhere where the fairness doctrine actually still does somewhat apply is that Sinclair deal. Back in, I think it was like 3 years ago, 2018. And Sinclair was just a media group that kind of bought up all these local news outlets, pretty much monopolized local news. And so we kind of have this interesting dichotomy of, it actually seems like local news is right biased, and it seems like national news is more left biased, because Sinclair actually is like a technically a local broadcast network that isn't giving fair news. Because like I live near Sacramento, so we get their channels, and it's funny because like if you watch like national coverage or turn on like the nightly news on NBC with Lester Holt, it's quite like centrist left. But if you watch local news, it's quite more favorable for Republicans. It's quite more favorable to Donald Trump. And it's just kind of interesting to see this dichotomy. So I kind of wonder, because like a lot of rural areas, I think the people watch more local news than national news. And so you do see this dichotomy. And I feel like a group like Sinclair, if the fairness doctrine was still being enforced, they wouldn't probably be allowed to be doing what they're doing, because I don't have specific examples just because I don't watch enough of like local news. But there's a lot of criticism that Sinclair's covered stories like from a lot of like Trump sycophants, like Mike Lindell, Mr. My Pillow, he's done interviews on some of these local talk news radio shows and stuff, and it's just kind of weird.
Yeah, there's this famous video right here where it's like I'll wait for the ad, but where you can see all the Sinclair stations have the same script.
San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
Balanced.
But
we are concerned about the trouble and trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
Yeah.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish.
So anyway, you get the idea. They're not like their message they're saying is not wrong, but like kind of like that idea of like the government, who decides what's fair, right? Also, like Sinclair, like who decides what's like real? Like they're saying they're real news. I'm like, I don't think maybe that's true, right? So, oh man,
yeah,
it's complicated.
Yeah, and the one thing I just want to add on that is that I think one of the best criticisms of the fairness doctrine, it was in that Heritage Foundation one, where it basically said that there was a fear of FCC retaliation. And so basically, even though the fairness doctrine required you to basically show opposing views, sometimes because you don't want retaliation from those views, you just don't even bring them up in the first place.
Right.
And I feel like that's kind of what we see sometimes, especially in local news, is that you just don't cover the other side, or like you don't even cover the actual importance of a topic because you don't really want a response. And I think we've seen that time and time again, with or without the fairness doctrine, which is just an issue with news. But I think you're right that we need a campaign of better like education on dealing with news, and it's something new. But I really do agree with you there.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Like just editorial board. Like even if the stories you print are pretty unbiased, it's still the selection of what stories you decide to put on your paper or articles that still is like shows a bias. And just like that, like you said, like for fear of retribution or retaliation or having to abide by the fairness doctrine, people won't do some stuff. Or today, maybe not for the fairness doctrine, or not because of the fairness doctrine, but for fear of like audience like Twitter lashback. Some people won't run some stories. So definitely to wrap this up, I think we're both in agreement that the fairness doctrine, the FCC legislation of the fairness doctrine is outdated. Bringing that back will not solve the current woes we have with fake news. And anyone that says bring back the fairness doctrine to end Fox News, it does not know what they're talking about. But I still would go to say that I think we're both in agreement that we do need to do something about what we're seeing as far as misinformation and disinformation with the actual nefarious purposes online and how people get their news sources. So I don't know if we're going to solve this problem tonight, but I do think we can glean something from the fairness doctrine, but it's not going to solve this problem.
Absolutely. And yeah, to be honest, like I think we need things like Fox News and OAN to be checked, and we need people to maybe be able to, sift through that information a little bit better. But in the end of the day, I don't really want to live in a world where Fox News isn't allowed, to be completely honest, because I think that would just be a slippery slope. So I agree with you, but I don't think we're going to get to solving this tonight. I do think we're in agreement that the fairness doctrine doesn't need to be reinstated. So that's a start.
Yeah. Well, let us know your thoughts about the fairness doctrine. Do you believe it's outdated? Do you believe it should be, refurbished for the modern era? Or is this idea of government determining fairness in media just something we shouldn't touch altogether? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're watching live, stay tuned. We're going to have a guest come on and talk about, the authoritarian slip in Turkey. And if you're watching the recordings, look for that uploaded in a few days as well. Thank you, everyone, for taking a look at the Tonic Accord.